we've got Yong Hao Poo, Chief Investment Officer at UBS, joining in on the show. Thanks very much, Yong Hao, for joining in. To start off with, foreign institutional investors are beginning to return to Asia and India. However, it's not on their map. What are the concerns about India?
For the foreign investor, I think the biggest concern is still rupee. If rupee is going to depreciate further, it could wipe off their gain on the stock market. I think recently we see S&P put the Indian on the watch, and it's kind of still very cautious in terms of outlook. I think a key issue is that India is running a bigger than expected fiscal deficit, and on the current account side, India's deficit is going to be very persistent. I think with the potential risk of the European Bank further deleveraging, withdraw the funds from the Asia, India could be very exposed to those kind of risk. That's why rupee is always under pressure since the later last year. Investors are very cautious on the Indian stock market.
Now, Yong Hao, the fall in the rupee has effectively wiped out any gains that foreign investors may have made on equities in calendar 2012. How are you viewing the Indian rupee? If all indications are that it will indeed drop to the 55 to 56 level against the dollar in the near term, would that factor alone be enough to keep foreign investors on the sidelines?
We would not project that level, but we are cautious. In general, we positive on the Asian currency, like Sing dollar, like Malaysia ringgit, Korean won, and renminbi to a certain extent. But we are very cautious on the Indian rupee because exactly what I mentioned earlier, the persistent trade deficit plus the huge fiscal deficit. That's why we think that the rupee has a risk to devalue further.
Yong Hao, you've said that you're advising investors to stay defensive and diversified for the long to medium term in Asia while actively exploring opportunities in the market. What opportunities do you see in Asia's emerging markets?
Well, overall, we are relatively neutral in terms of equity allocation, but we still have a little bit of sort of taking on a little bit of risk on the credit side. For example, we advise our clients to take on high yield credit in the US because the default rate is relatively low, and we see the yield are very attractive in the high yield space. In Asia, I think we are also overweight on the let's say China and so on. So in that sense, we are still positive in the emerging market equity as a whole. And within Asia, we like China because the valuation looks quite attractive. Of course, Hong Kong also looks attractive because the valuation are cheap, and Singapore looks like also interesting. But on the India and Indonesia side, we are relatively cautious.
Right, Yong, I'm going to come to you in just a moment, but let's address the European equity markets, which have just opened. As expected, they've opened in the red. All the three key indexes, that's Paris, Frankfurt and London, all three of them are in the red. But Yong Hao, let's come back to you. You did mention that you are cautious on India, that structural inflation remains a key risk for India. Now, the worry is that WPI inflation in India could climb from current levels over the next few quarters. How would you advise investors then to play the India story in a high inflation scenario?
Well, I think India, obviously, for the relative longer term, we are still bullish on the Indian's structural upside, demographics, structural reform, infrastructural investment, consumption upgrading. All these are positive structural story. But in the short term, as you said, inflation is a potential risk, which may limit RBI's monetary policy easing, and economic activity may remain relatively sluggish. So in that sense, we may like a little bit some of the sector, for example, pharmaceutical sectors or IT sectors and so on. But in general, we are underweight on the Indian. On the credit side, we are also cautious because the S&P put a negative watching on the Indian, and that will probably limit those investment grade bond of Indian, which if you have a negative sort of the status, then there could be a risk of downgrade. Of course, we are still only expecting like 30 to 40% of risk being downgrade, but still it's a material risk we need to watch closely.
Right, Yong-Hao Pu, many thanks for coming in on the show with your perspective on what the outlook for Asia and India in particular is going forward.